So the background to this is the work of Adolf Reinach, who invented speech act theory in 1913 or thereabouts. And it's probably the case that John Searle never read Reinach, but it's certainly the case that Gilbert Ryle read Reinach. Gilbert Ryle was another philosopher in Oxford at the time when Searle was in Oxford. And we have Gilbert Ryle's copy of Reinach's collected works, which is heavily annotated in Gilbert Ryle's hand. So the second component is going to be Searle's theory of money. So Searle gets money wrong, I will show, but correcting Searle is very enlightening because it reveals a feature of social acts which is normally neglected. And then the idea is that commercial acts are much more complicated than we suppose because they involve not merely, as is the case typically, the exchange of physical goods or physical services, but also the exchange of rights and obligations. And so that's what the talk is primarily about, this feature of commercial exchanges. So this is Reinach's account of the promise, which is the core structure in his theory of social acts. So we have a promisor and a promisee. We have an act of speaking, an act of registering, because if you don't hear me and acknowledge my making a promise, then the promise was not successfully constituted. And the important thing is that in the very act of speaking, an obligation and a claim come into being. And these are mutually dependent upon each other. And they have the very same content as the content of the promise, namely to do F, whatever F is, for the benefit of the promisee. So when I make a promise, I am obliged to do F, and the person to whom I make the promise has a claim on me to do F. An obligation and claim come into being as if by magic, and they are not physical. Now, the problem is that Searle's ontology of social reality is based on physics, because Searle thinks that everything in the universe is a physical entity. So Searle's account of social objects goes like this. A social object Y is really just a physical object X, but X counts as being a special kind of social object. So Donald Trump counts as president, and this big pile of stones over here counts as being a cathedral, and this piece of paper, at this point, Searle will reach into his pocket and pull out a dollar bill. I don't have any dollar bills, but I have a euro bill, and I say this is a 10 euro note. And what that means is that this very piece of paper is a 10 euro note because it counts as legal currency in Austria. So X must always be physical, and a Y term in Searle's account is just a physical X term viewed in a certain way. And this doesn't work for money. It works for dollar bills, but it doesn't work for the money in your bank account. But you have money in your bank account. Money comes in two forms. It comes in the physical form, and it comes in this other, almost magical form, which is money in your bank account. Now, most money in the universe, in the world, is non-physical money. And so that's, in a way, the more important kind of money. And so in his paper, where he expresses his theory of money, he says the bits in the computer drive count as money. But that's wrong. No one would take bits in a computer drive and try and buy something with them. What you have in the computer is something which is a representation of money, but the money itself is not inside the computer. So these are what I call freestanding Y terms. They are Y terms that don't have an X term, and the core of all social and cultural phenomena, all intellectual property, is freestanding Y terms. Even Romeo and Juliet might very well be freestanding Y terms. But of course, we can't talk about Romeo and Juliet because they don't exist. So, freestanding Y terms are very important, and they're important also for understanding commercial exchange. Now, there is an ontology which is closely related to the ontology I'll be describing here, which is called FIBO, which is a financial industry business ontology. They have a pretty good definition of service, a pretty good account in the axioms. The problem is that they don't define any parent class for service. So they say economic activity, but that's not defined. And they use the word activity also when in the term commercial activity, but they define that as a context, which is, ontologically speaking, not really very acceptable. And so FIBO needs a top-level ontology. There is, in fact, a BFO version of FIBO, but it's not public, unfortunately. All right, so we built the ontology of commercial exchange using BFO, and I think everybody knows more or less what BFO is. So we have generically dependent continuants, which are maybe freestanding Y-term-like, and some generically dependent continuants are what we call information entities, information content entities. For instance, the content of the sentence, this is a presentation of BFO. All right, so first of all, this is not a commercial exchange. If I have an apple in my hand and I give you the apple, then that's just a physical process. I had possession of the apple, you now have possession of the apple. So now I'm going to live dangerously. That's just physical possession, it's not ownership. And so we have an act of transferring, we have 3 objects which participate in the act, and 1 process which is just moving the apple from one place to another and fitting it into a new site created by somebody's fist. But now if I give you an apple in the deontic sense, that means I transfer a right. I own the apple, that's the starting point. I have an owner role, and the apple has an owned role, and both of those inhere respectively in me and in the apple. The apple is a participant in the act of giving, but the act of giving brings it about that, hang on, I'm pointing in the wrong direction. I really am living dangerously. This is the post stage. So the act of giving moves the roles. I no longer play a role in the literal sense of that expression. I no longer play a role. Once I've given you the apple, or Brown in this case, then Brown is the person with the role. The apple still has an owned role, but now it's a different owned role because it's dependent upon the owner role, which inheres now in Brown. Now, when we're talking about commercial exchange, we're talking about exchange which involves documents of one sort or another, including financial documents, so dollar bills. And we have an ontology called the Document Acts ontology, or D-Acts, which is based on the same Reinach Searle background as the one I just described. And we define a social act as an act involving conscious beings or organizations. Really, that's all we need to say. It's a planned process in the sense that it's an intentional process. So when we engage in social acts, we're engaging them in them deliberately. We're not just crashing into people while walking down the street with our eyes closed. So examples are given here. And the most interesting example here is signing for a charge on a credit card. That is a social act which involves a document. And it involves a document act of signing. So the Document Acts ontology contains treatments of the basic entities of a deontic ontology, things like permissions, obligations, and so on, and of deontic roles, which Searle talks about. So Searle gets deontic roles pretty much right. It's when it comes to dealing with Y terms which don't have X terms that he goes wrong. And so we define a deontic role here. A role in BFO is something which is externally grounded. A disposition in BFO is something which is grounded in the physics of the bearer. So I have a role not because I have some property of a physical nature, but because I am deemed to have a certain status by my society or by a particular group of people, by my employer or whatever it might be. That brings about normative expectations which will bring about dispositions, for instance, dispositions on the part of the people in my social group to punish me if I break my promises. And then we have deontic declarations, which are speech acts or document acts which create or revoke roles. And then we have specifically deontic document acts, which are deontic declarations which create or revoke roles by manipulating documents. So it could be signing a document, it could be destroying a document, it could be presenting a document to a customs officer, for instance. It could be annotating a document, revising a document. All of these are document acts. All right, so the ontology of commercial exchange, we define a commercial exchange as a special kind of social act in which something of value is transferred and relevant deontic roles switch parties. That's why we talk about exchange. So there is an exchange of deontic roles, and it turns out that that exchange is the most important feature of commercial exchanges. So this is an example of gifting, which is an example of a one-sided commercial exchange, if you like. So I volunteer to Brown that I will mow his lawn. Now, that means I've made a promise. So I acquire an obligation and he acquires a claim. But we're interested in the role which I have as a service provider. So now I am the provider of a certain service. That means I have a certain role. Roles in BFO are realizable entities, and this service role is realized in my doing some lawn mowing, and Brown has a recipient of a service role, and that recipient is also realized in the mowing of the lawn, that recipient role. And now we can do an exchange. So I can volunteer to mow Brown's lawn, and in return he will fix my car. So now we switch the provider and the recipient roles. The obligations aren't in here, but we thereby also switch the obligations and the claims. And that's why we talk about an exchange. And so that's really just a more spaghetti-like picture of the same thing. Okay, so now these are some terms from the ontology of commercial exchange. We have payments, buying acts, selling acts. And a buying act is illustrated here. So in order to have a buying act, you have to have a selling act. And the buying act and the selling act have the same object, which in this case is an apple on the one hand, which is the thing which goes from left to right, and a dollar bill on the other hand, which is the thing that goes from right to left. And the act of selling has as agent Jones, and the act of buying has as agent Brown. So Brown pays Jones a dollar bill, and everything else is as pictured on this picture. Now we have documents which are about exchanges, rather than documents like dollar bills, for instance, which are involved in exchanges. So I might, instead of just promising to give you a dollar for your apple, I might create a document which gives you a contractual claim on me to pay a certain amount of money for your apple. So this price quote document will describe a service, for instance, by means of a plan specification for some planned process, and then prescribe some act of payment, which you will then realize when I finish providing the service and give me the corresponding amount of money. And then when I quote a price to you, then that is a social act which has an output, a price quote document. And an invoice document does it from the back. So an invoice document is when I finish my service and then I send you a bill. And that by sending you a bill, I make you liable, that is to say, I oblige you to make the payment. And then when you do pay, I give you a receipt. The receipt then nullifies the claim. It destroys the deontic entity, which is my claim on you to pay the amount stated on the invoice. And now we get the core thesis of this talk. So we can have acts of commercial exchange which don't involve either physical objects or physical services. And that's what most of the financial services industry is all about. Nothing physical changes, but there are commercial exchanges going on of fantastic complexity. And I've here been talking only about very simple examples. So this was, I think, first seen clearly in a paper by Masson and Tiefenbach. So they recognize that exchanges of services constitute the most fundamental kind of economic exchanges, but even when we have just an exchange of goods, there is also an exchange of services, namely the actions of paying the money and providing the apple. They are services which are involved in buying and selling an apple. But also, they involve exchanges of rights. And that too is a dimension of the commercial exchange of buying an apple. You're exchanging rights to the apple from one person to another. And so there are three kinds of commercial exchange. There are those which involve exchanges of services. Actually, three kinds of commercial exchange not involving exchange of physical objects. One we've discussed involves exchange of services, which they call episodic goods. Then there is one which involves exchange of knowledge, which I didn't deal with, where for instance, someone teaches someone else and gets paid for it. So that's not a physical service, it's just talk. But it brings about an improvement, if you're lucky, in the mental state, mental capacities of the teachee, the student. And that improvement is worth money, again, if you're lucky. And so we have an exchange of services which involves payment of money from Brown to Jones and improvement of brain by Jones on Brown. And the same account would work for hairdressing and other kinds of personal services. So hairdressing is creating a new pattern on your head. Teaching is creating a new pattern in your brain. So the final slide, just to save time, is going to present a picture of what's involved when you exchange rights. So I own a certain piece of property in a certain place, and I sell you the rights to build on that piece of property. So nothing physical changes except a document, and the document allows you then, gives you a permission, which is another kind of deontic entity, to build something on what is my land. When we build ontologies, we always start by building the canonical case first. And the canonical case is a case in which all the parties are agreeing freely to engage in the exchange. And that's the canonical case of promising also. There can be a promise which is not freely entered into, but that would be a deviant case. So we wouldn't deal with that in the first run of the ontology. So the next stage would be to deal with preferences, which is, again, a more complicated matter than people normally think. And then the final stage would be to deal with those cases where commercial exchanges are effectuated under duress.
I always have this impression that I like the idea of having documents and document X and taking documents to be kind of continuous, right? But it seems to me that the life cycle of at least some of these documents are a complete reflection of the life cycle of some underlying entities they describe. So if you take, for example, car rental, and I decide to rent a car, there are exchanges of speech acts and so on, and then there is this document. And this document can evolve, it can change because I can decide to deliver the car in a different location, in a different time, date, and so on, right? So the document will change, but it's changing because there's this underlying thing, which is a rental as an object, as an aggregation of roles in the sense you just described, bundle of commitments and claims and so on. But there is this one thing that evolves, that can change in time, acquire new properties and so on. And the change in the document would be a reflection of that. So I was wondering if you have a take on that.
Yes, so the document, the role of the document is, in the first place, just to document what you just described. That's why we call it a document.
Yes.
But the point about the commercial realm is that documents about those things themselves become objects which can be exchanged. So if I take out a mortgage, the bank gives me $100,000. I give the bank the title to my house. The title to my house is then used by the bank as security on a loan which it issues to someone else. The bank does that for 100 people and then puts all of those securities together and makes a new document which describes them, and then uses that as a collateralized obligation which it sells to someone else, and so on. And that's where documents are no longer tracking changes in the physical world, not even deontic changes in the physical world. They're tracking other documents.
I fully agree. My point wasn't that documents have some sort of material basis in the sense at all. Was that, for example, in this slide, the contract, before you have the contract as a document, you have a contract as some sort of existentially dependent thing, binding the parts, right?
So in the olden days, we only had the document-free kind of contract. And it worked because in the olden days, we lived in small villages and everybody was watching everybody. And so people cheated very, very seldom. People could remember who owns what. You don't need documents. But gradually, as we moved into wider and wider societies, we could no longer rely on the memory of the participants. And so we needed, there's one more step, we needed to have documents as guarantees of memory. But then once we had documents as guarantees of memory, we could use the documents to create contracts. So instead of having a contract pre-existing, getting documented, we create the document first, which is, as it were, the draft of the contract. We edit it, we mess around with it, we change some clauses, and then print it again, and then sign it, and then we have a document, the contractual underpinnings of which were created by means of document acts, namely amending a clause, deleting a clause, and so on.
I wasn't trying to get rid of the document at all. I was
Good.
recognizing the existence of this underlying entity which the document documents.
And I agree, but I think that's only one small percentage of the gigantic edifice of documents that rule the commercial world. Yeah.
The other point is, if I may ask another question. So the roles would be existential dependent things,
yeah.
right? So when you talk about exchange of rights, it's a metaphorical talk, right? So the rights are things which inhere in me. So if I make if you have a right
yes.
to something...
You're right. So I shouldn't talk about exchange of rights. I should talk about destruction and immediate reconstitution in another person or on another person.
And that would work also for things which are existentially dependent on multiple things. Like my contract with you cannot be transferred in a literal sense to anyone.
Absolutely, yes, I agree. Yeah. There's a lot of destruction going on. So, first of all, Jones is the provider of the service implies that Jones is
First he is offering the service.
has so,
First he is offering the service, and later.
yeah, he's offering this. Yeah, but this is giving, so this is meant to be the simple case. So, and I'm not sure whether, in order to give somebody the service of mowing their lawn, you have to make sure, first of all, that they would like you to mow their lawn. I assume that they would, in which case you have a kind of negotiation beforehand. But I agree, I haven't specified the deontic roles in this case.
But I guess we should move to the next presentation just to stay on time. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.